In all my days, I had never met anyone like him. His skin was laminated with a ghastly grey shine. His hair was essentially a cloud of wool, and his clothes looked to be inseparable from his body. But it was more than that, for his shabby formal wear was just as much a part of him as the broken skin at the corners of his mouth. I only met him the once, and throughout our short-lived evening, he never once spoke a word. I sat with him at my dining table. He was a total stranger. My wife, Margaret, had often criticised my unwillingness to show hospitality to even our closest friends and family. Yet there I was, hosting this thing, a man I knew nothing of. From the first moment I set eyes on him, standing on the other side of the doorway, a foreign feeling washed over me. Guilt consumed me, though I had no idea what I had done to make me feel that way. I was overcome with desperation. I had to relinquish my feelings of guilt, and the only way I knew how was to please this man. I invited him in without consulting my wife, not that she minded. She wound up being even more enamoured by him than I was, though she seemed more motivated by carnal lust than by feelings of culpability. Nothing about it made any sense. Even ignoring his strange otherworldly qualities, he was not at all what would be considered a conventionally attractive man. His eyes were droopy. His flat nose was several sizes too short for the rest of his face. He was missing his front teeth, and he had dark spots all over his jaw. If I had to estimate an age, I'd have put him in his late 40s, though he was undoubtedly hard-worn for that. When he first reached for the salt, I was sure that his freakish hand would pass right through it. There was a weightlessness to him, and I knew that regardless of what he was not entirely there with us. To my surprise, he not only picked up the salt, but he managed to devour an entire 3-course meal. Something I found peculiar was that he did not once drink any liquid. He refused many offers of booze, opting only for a glass of water, which he specifically requested somehow telepathically contain a thick wedge of lime in it. The water sat on the table by his resting wrist for the entire meal. Not once did he even touch the glass. After eating is when things took an even stranger turn. Dinner had not cured me of my guilty conscience, and as Margaret cleared the table, I found myself involuntarily on my knees, weeping. He did not spare me so much as a glance as I began begging for him to forgive me. Margaret returned to the room, immediately bombarding me with questions. I looked up at her, lost and confused. I had just spent the best part of 2 minutes speaking in Latin. I had no idea how. I didn't even know any Latin. I remained where I was. The man got up from his seat, still paying me no mind. He and Margaret left the room together. They did not return for some time, and I did not move. When they came back, they were not the same. I swear his face had changed shape entirely. I should have felt something more than I did, but when I saw Margaret, I felt naught but the faintest tingle in my chest. My wife's skin now shared the same laminated ghastly shine as his. Her eyes were soulless, and it was as though she no longer understood that I was in the house with them. She was no longer there. The man approached me, still on my knees. He leaned over, placing his hands on my shoulders. His touch was devoid of physical force, though it felt like I was being washed over by an icy storm. One of his hands slipped onto my neck, and he placed a kiss on the side of my head, just above my right ear. Words cascaded through the most inner parts of my mind. Images flashed before my eyes. I saw him, but that's not all. I saw myself. I saw everything, and I saw nothing. Then they were both gone. So was my guilt. All I was left with was a scar where his lips had blessed me. I did not feel sad for my loss, not even for a moment, for despite all that had come and gone, I now knew. He had come from the other side, and I knew that life had no meaning.
She held a small woven basket with crocuses, lilies, and gardening tools. The damp grass tickled her ankles as she kneeled before an engraved headstone. The purple heather she planted last had already turned brown, the petals dissolving in the earth below. The crux of her grief ensued every spring, as roots rapidly grew and cast vegetation into new-found life, growing around her brother's body as it decomposed quietly and ineluctably. Each breath welcomed the pleasant scent of drenched soil and moss, bringing her just a fragment of solace. She dug in the soil with the little shovel she kept in her basket and smoothed the soil back over the crocus roots. The white lilies were placed in a ceramic pot next to the headstone. She would often sit down on the bench underneath the oak tree, though it was now dewy with rain droplets. The sun set behind the tall Gothic towers as she wiped her hands clean of dirt. Colored windows reflected light onto the peaks of the stones and mausoleums. She lingered near a most intriguing grave of aged crumbled stone. It was a statue of a man resting on top of a sculpted tomb. She studied the splintered statue, tracing his tranquil hands, which folded in prayer. A sudden chill prickled her skin as mist crept from her feet and up the walls of stone until it had engulfed the sculpture of the man. The drumming of her heart turned deafening, was the tangible mist shaped itself after the statue's every crevice. Her limbs turned as stiff as the stone statue she gazed upon as she swore the mist caused movement in the statue's engraved eyelids. It was further shaped until it appeared to be living and breathing. A single indiscernible word made the hairs on her neck stand. The near-palpable aura emitting from the mist made her languid. She felt inclined to leave, but a curious blue orb kept her stagnant. The fog sunk into the stone and disappeared. A crackling spectacle ensued, with a tremendous force. The statue began detaching itself from the block of stone. The blood in her veins turned to frost when she registered a resounding groan from the statue. The stones from his limbs crackled like fireworks when he sat upright. Like a convulsing mechanism, he turned his head, eyes gleaming with light. She stumbled backwards with terror-struck eyes, falling over the hem of her dress. "Don't be frightened," it said with a rumbling deep voice that imaginably shook the ground. Her lip quivered, but she said not a word. The moss-covered man moved slowly, gurgling and groaning as his feet hit the ground. "Did you get hurt?" he muttered, fog exiting his mouth as he huffed. With cold, trembling hands, she pushed herself off the ground. She caught a glimpse of humanity in his voice. "How is this possible?" her weak voice sounded through the air. "My body's buried here." She saw the light in his eyes, dark blue and pure. Faded colors took form across the tired, cracked stone as the mist circled around the gray figure. "I need your help. Please, dig up my body," he said. Her heart sank to the pits of her gut. "You have lived?" she asked, madly horrified by the implications of his words. "Yes, though I cannot rest. Not here." He struggled towards her, his tremendous aura like the coldest of winter storms. As she observed his feeble limbs, she compared him to an infant just learning how to walk, and the initial shock lessened. She had to take her chances to inquire about her brother. Perhaps the spirits could talk to each other, if this was a spirit at all. "If I help you, I will need something in return." His head tilted forward with a crack, orbs staring into her hazel eyes. "What is it that you want?" She turned towards her brother's grave, raising her questions about the afterlife and what it could mean for her only sibling. The man's glowing eyes shimmered, a sorry grunt leaving his gray lips. The conversation was slow and he spent long finding his words. Her heart kept on sinking. Ultimately promised to her that he would return and bring back whatever information he could find on her brother. She gleamed with hope again and immediately began searching for something to dig up the man's carcass. She shoveled until her hands ached, until her yellow dress turned filthy with dirt. By her side was the man sweeping soil away with his hands of solid stone. The steel blade at last hit a decaying wooden lid, and for the rest of the night she carried out the statue's bitings. The pitch-black sky encircled them, the sole light source being at the cathedral entrance. A light that would carry her through many dark evenings while she lingered on her usual bench near her brother's grave. Her eyes ever fixated on a lifeless statue, anticipating the blue and glimmering mist's return. There was a time before the dinosaurs walked the earth, where 2 million years went by under the spell of constant rain. The world was blurred by a cloak of constant mists, Stormy nights were all there was, as the sun had retreated behind thick dark clouds. The rain began by a result of tremendous amounts of magma seeping out from cracks in the earth, volcanic ash and acid rapidly turning the surface uninhabitable for most living things. The fumes from the eruptions combined with the acidic rain wreaked havoc in all the Earth's ecosystems. The lava caused rumbling fires that went rampant through the forests, as drops of toxic water hit the surface of the ocean and cascaded into a million. Below the surface, life scarcely withstood the battle against the climate. After thousands of years of constant downpour, a distinct organism began forming in the depths of the ocean. It grew as other life diminished. It started as a round speck, eventually morphing into a moving creature. The new species took its time perfecting itself, energized by the changes in the atmosphere. The creature was a magma consumer, created as a result of its environment. And so the earth had a natural enemy of the rain. The animal was not an amphibian, a fish, nor a mammal. Reptiles appeared to survive the new climate, but it was not a reptile either, as it wasn't made of flesh and bones at all. It consisted of stone and metal, being the only of its kind. Its insides were stronger than steel, a hard shell of stone covering its exterior, strong limbs wading through the terrain at the bottom of the sea, consuming gas and magma, growing as large as a whale, though with long arms and a mouth of steel which was shaped like a clam. Every part of its body was resistant to heat, without a nose, eyes, or ears. Using its hands to feel around for sources of heat, it would move onto land to feast when volcanoes were near, inhaling magma with its massive mouth. The rain lessened as it prevented the volcanic acids from reaching the atmosphere to feed the clouds, and it grew larger and greater with each meal. For thousands of years, it tirelessly labored to seal the breaches in the earth, unbeknownst to itself that it was saving the planet. Their efforts at last began showing fruits as they'd grown as large as mountains, consuming much larger amounts of gas and magma. The rain eased up, and the sun shone through the curtain of clouds hanging over the earth, the beams creating glimmers in the salt crystallizing on the cliffs. Flowers and plants budding, taking their first breath in the light of the sun. In time, the ocean and land ruled over the sky once more. The molten lava slowly turned to dark obsidian, leaving the saviors of the earth to starve. The creatures retreated into caves in the depths, their stone shells disguising them as reefs and rocks. They lay in hibernation, resting until the day comes where another volcanic outburst fills the world with shadow and rain. Nearly blinding lights flickered on in the darkest hour of the night as a clueless soul stepped inside. A whisper of an address awoke an on-call security guard. Wary eyes observed the 100 thin needles scattered across the white-tiled floors. On the bench, used for treatments, lay crinkled sheets prickled with needle holes. The fabric damp with subtle stains, adorning what seemed to be several people's worth of fluids. Lavender oil kissed the air with each drag of breath, along with something rusty. Jars of herbs and dried roots stood orderly in the wooden shelves, along with an array of incense. The metal tray bearing cotton swabs and broken glass was placed askew on the side table, nearly tipping over. Shattered glass squeaked when its heavy soles shifted in place. The broken shards cascaded around the remaining unharmed glass cups, which were still oozing with herbal smoke. The echo from the dripping ceiling gradually grasped the guard's attention. As if raw skin set on fire in an instant, the hairs on every limb stood with terror. Eyes wide as they vividly imagined the preceding events. Oceans of dread cast over him as a drop of liquid hit his forehead. A splash that resounded through his core, as if discouraging any and every wishful belief still clinging to his core.
That all? Yes, I think so, muttered the security guard while he fidgeted with his tie. Detective Manark had put away his pen and notepad before the man had even answered. Let's go, Paulson, the detective barked, heading inside the clinic. Don't you think we should call this in? Asked Paulson, nervously following Manark through the seedy doorway. What for? Manark kept moving forward into the clinic, taking forceful steps across the white-tiled floor. Paulson, by contrast, was moving cautiously, her footsteps almost silent. That guard said, "Never mind that pansy. He's clueless." He seemed pretty shaken up to me, refuted Paulson, choosing to ignore Manark's choice of words. I think he must have seen something bad. Did you actually take a look at the guy, Paulson, or were you too busy fixing your hair in the window reflection? What kind of man in security wears a pink polka dot tie? Sir, I don't see how his choice of tie matters much. Shh! Manark abruptly hushed her, his open palm coming within an inch of hitting her mouth as she came to a halt. You hear that? The lights above them flickered eerily as they stood in the hallway. Hear what? Paulson whispered, her eyes darting around as she tried to catch a glimpse of any potential danger. The hairs on her arms were standing on end beneath her shirt, and for a moment she questioned what she was ever thinking when she got into this line of work. There were definitely people better equipped for this than she was. My stomach. I haven't eaten since noon. Do you know how many fucking hours that is, Paulson? Paulson was speechless. She watched as the detective picked at the inside of his nose with no shame or care at all. How many more nights was she doomed to work with this repulsive man? She didn't know how much more she could possibly take, especially after the ordeal at the subway station a few shifts back. How was it possible that he only seemed to be getting worse? I take it math ain't one of your strengths, Paulson, Manark scoffed. I'm sure you can count just fine when it comes to pretty flower petals. Spoiler alert, he loves you not. I'm married to a woman, Paulson stated plainly. And? Manark swung open the treatment room door, holding it open for Paulson to enter first. In we go, dollface. His repugnant yellow grin made her want to turn and run, but she didn't. She stepped past him, holding her breath to avoid having to inhale any more of his vinegary scent. His pores were practically leaking booze, so much so that it was discernible over the strong scent of lavender that filled the room. For a moment, she almost suggested he open a winery. No, she thought, a pickle business ought to suit him better. Shattered glass shifted under her boots as she moved in and inspected the room. She found herself fixated on various glass cups, still intact, that were interspersed between the broken glass on the floor. Careful with that, Paulson, Manark quipped. Those will give you a nasty cut, even with a twat as coarse as yours. Joe! Paulson erupted. He had pushed her beyond her limit this time. Even if she had still felt capable of biting her tongue, she did not want to. This is beyond inappropriate. I think you mean Detective Manark, he shot back in an instant, staring right at her. She was seething. I think you need to calm down, Paulson. Lighten up a little. She would have unleashed mayhem, tearing him down with her words, stripping him of his mental armor, and digging her verbal dagger deep into his tightest wounds, just as she had practiced in the mirror so many times before. She would have, if it had not been for the scarlet bead that dripped down from above their heads, skimming the very tip of Manark's nose before splashing against the floor, adding to the small puddle of blood already gathered there. The guard wasn't lying, Paulson muttered. Don't you wear tampons, Paulson? Manark immediately remarked. But woefully, there was no time for her to deride him, as a loud crash reached their ears from the next room over. Without wasting a second, they both sprung into action, quickly rushing out of the room and over to the next one. They clutched tight to their firearms, Manark taking the lead without hesitation. As they crept cautiously into the room, the needle-infested floor revealed itself, and a treatment bench stood in the center of the room. On the far side of the room was an open window, and beneath the ledge was a broken vase. Just a wind, Paulson, Manark sighed, holstering his weapon and stepping towards the bench. The wind knocked over a vase? Paulson scratched her head. It wasn't even windy outside. Uncharacteristically, Manark did not respond. He was too busy inspecting the treatment bench, which was draped in a wrinkled white sheet. It looked as though there was something, or maybe someone, underneath it. Well, 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 Manark chuckled. You never mentioned a body. Can you believe these fucking hippies? Manark began ranting, inspecting the needle holes that covered the white sheet as he began to pull it back. What's wrong with real medicine? If you want to stick needles in your arms, maybe just stick to heroin. She could have said something. She could have said anything. But she didn't. Paulson didn't say a word. Later, she felt a sort of sick satisfaction. She almost hated herself for it. She had noticed almost right away that the body was moving slightly. But when Detective Manark began pulling down the sheet, she said nothing. And when the blood-soaked hand wielding a jagged shard of glass shot up and tore through his neck, she did nothing. 4 days later, Paulson was promoted to detective. Where did he go? He definitely came in here. Then where the hell is he? There's no other way out. The storage room was tight, packed with cardboard boxes, filing cabinets, and not much else. The two thugs could not make sense of how they had suddenly lost track of their victim, a young man named Amir. Amir's heart raced as he got to his feet, doing his best to compose himself. He was alone in the room. It had been at least 15 minutes since those thugs had chased him, so he reckoned he was likely safe now. For the first time in his life, he felt somewhat proud of his abilities. "What's it like?" asked Miriam, a strange and bubbly young girl with bright-coloured hair. "Huh?" Amir scratched his head. "When you change, what does it feel like?" Amir didn't know how to answer that. The truth was, he didn't feel much at all when he transformed. He couldn't see or hear anything, not even darkness. It wasn't as if cardboard boxes had eyes or ears. No, when Amir transformed, he simply wasn't. "Isn't it scary?" asked Hugo, an overly thin man with a patchy handlebar moustache. He was the oldest one there, and by quite a wide margin. Despite appearing friendly, Amir couldn't help but be a little creeped out while his big beady eyes were locked on him. "Let's not be too invasive," butted in Jordan, the leader of the support group. "Let's all bear in mind that this is Amir's first time sharing. It's not every day we get a newbie sharing on their first day." Amir appreciated Jordan's intervention. He really hadn't even intended on sharing anything yet, but Jordan had put him at ease earlier after opening the session with a story of his own. Amir had always been ashamed of his worthless and embarrassing superpower. In a world filled with people who could carry buildings on their backs, fly, read minds, and control the weather, Amir had been cursed with the measly ability to transform into a box. It all seemed so unfair to him, but when Jordan spoke of his own powers, it made Amir feel less awful. Jordan had the ability to toast bread, any piece of bread, whether it was sourdough, whole grain, or even ciabatta. Jordan could toast it almost instantly, just using his mind. At first, Amir thought that at least he might have a good career in the breakfast industry, but that was before Jordan explained that the bread didn't warm when he toasted it. Was there really a market for cold toast? Probably not. "Miriam, would you like to share something with us today?" asked Jordan. "Sure," Miriam smiled. Amir thought she looked overtly joyful to be part of the group. Everyone else looked so dour, and for good reason. "Hi, I'm Miriam." "Hi, Miriam," the full group spoke back in unison. "As most of you know, Bindi was having some problems with a cat. She's been really frightened for a while now, and this past weekend, things got even worse." Miriam's expression sank, and her eyes dropped to the floor. Audible gasps were heard around the room while Miriam seemingly tried to hold back tears. "Fortunately, I was there, and I saved her just in time. I decided to chase the cat to find out where it came from. It ran into my neighbor's house. I knocked on the door, and when my neighbor answered..." Amir was on the edge of his seat. He had no idea who Bindi was or the context of the story, but Miriam's intense display of emotion had his heart invested. "Take your time," Jordan spoke softly, and Miriam wiped moisture from her eyelids. "I saw whiskers on her face." The entire room gasped loudly. "My neighbor Helen, who I've known for years. I thought she was a telepath, but no, she's actually a shapeshifter." Miriam looked up at Amir for a moment. "Though I'm not sure she can turn into a cardboard box. I only know about the cat." There was silence for a while. "Okay, I'm done." "That's rough," said Jordan. "Thanks for sharing, Miriam." "Thanks for sharing," the room repeated in unison. "Yes, Amir?" asked Jordan, noticing that Amir had raised his hand slightly above his head. "Not to be rude, but I just wondered if I could ask." "We don't normally do that, Amir," Jordan interrupted him. "It's okay," Miriam spoke up. "What is it?" Who is Bindi?" Amir shuffled in his seat a little. "Oh, I guess you wouldn't know," Miriam giggled, swinging her legs under her chair. "Bindi is my friend. She's a snail." A snail? That's my power. I can talk to snails." Amir was quiet for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. "This is maybe weird to ask, but my grandma actually has a slug infestation in her kitchen right now. Would it be possible to..." "No!" Miriam was abrupt. "Only snails. No slugs. I thought slugs were just snails without homes." "That's a filthy lie!" Miriam screamed, leaping out of her chair. Amir was sure she was about to wallop him. "Miriam!" Jordan intervened. "Please calm down. Sorry, Amir muttered. It's all right. Miriam's tone quickly switched from rage to sickly sweet. She sat back down and smiled at Jordan. I think that's enough questions for today, Jordan sighed. Who would like to share next? Oh, me, called out Hugo. Very well, Hugo. The floor is yours. Hi, I'm Hugo. Hi, Hugo, the group spoke. I can taste things just by looking at them, and you'll never believe what I saw yesterday.
On the very top of the lookout, he could see everything. So high up, the deadly waves seemed small. The crashing against the boulders below faint compared to the rather glaring wind. The storm was rattling the windows of the old lighthouse as if it just might shatter them. He had a fragrant cup of tea in his hand, tapping his foot softly on the wooden floor as he took in the view laid out in front of him. A sense of stillness and calm taking over, despite the rattling, creaks and croaks. He had utter peace of mind, for he was in complete solitude. The gale and sea could not scar him. Whenever he thought of the words pain or agony, it was never of the physical kind. The pain wrecking his spirit, gobbling up all of his vitality, was human beings. Creatures that always find a way to weasel their way into your life, like pests infesting your space. His former job appeared to others as easy, the calm life of a librarian, surrounded by literature, though the work he often did had nothing to do with renting out books, nor stamping back pages. He was an unusual reviewer of these stories, one who read books not to escape the world, but to vividly experience it. His senses would heighten, feeling every emotion as vividly as the author intended them. He wanted a break from the impacts of others' emotions, convoluting his own. He needed to be near his dearest, the sea, the waves, and the gulls, the calm of the salty scents, shores, and soft sand. The sea did not feel, it simply existed, falling and cresting. The ocean felt more humane than any person he had ever faced. He dreaded having to open another book in his life, or to have another soul invade his force field of an aura. The first rat skull he had collected was broken, cracked in the middle, now at the top of his work desk along with bird skeletons and feathers. A compass speckled with a layer of dust laid near the resourceful decorations he'd collected. The large radio in the middle of the desk was constantly turned on, the ships communicating their passage through the Gulf. He trimmed the wicks and lit the oil lamp, a scent he treasured. His reminder that night was approaching. The argent reflections of the sun dimmed, and he'd no longer have to squint through the binoculars. The large light on top of the building providing just the right amount of light. His brother would come to mind when ships passed in the distance, hoping the waves would carry on his well wishes. The wind howled, resonating through the cylinder of a building. His cup of tea had turned icy, and he was famished, still not in a hurry to get up from the comfort of his chair. In the stormy night, a light flickered from the shoreline, the smallest of boats navigating the crushing waves. He shot up, knees wobbling at the quick pace in which he stood to his feet, grasping tightly at his binoculars, breath picking up as the sea sent the boat leaping. He had no time. The rowboat forcefully collided with the shoreline boulders. He stuffed his feet into green and yellow rain boots a second before racing down the spiral stairs, gasping for air by the time he slammed the door open, greeted by sideways rain and a howling scream down by the craters. His lashes could barely hold the weight of the droplets splashing onto his face, nothing but a thin shirt on with his rain boots. The sea roared as he helplessly watched a woman struggle to her death, washed too far away with nothing to hold on to, disappearing underneath a rush of fresh waves. The sea had gone mad with anger. Up close it wasn't any longer the peaceful friend he'd sought so desperately. The screaming continued, and he noticed another person near the boat's carcass, a man holding on for dear life, grasping at a sharp stone slab. The pressure around his temple caused him to stumble forward. With heavy steps, he found footing on the boulders, stretching as far down as he could to grasp the man's forearm, pulling until his cheeks burst into red hues. The man nearly cost him his life, grasping onto him so acutely he almost lost his balance and sent them both into the depths. With no clue how, he accomplished hauling them both to flat ground. The larger man he'd just saved looked around with feverish eyes, searching, his soul lost and drained by the fury of the waters. He sobbed into the grass, as at last he understood the woman he held dear had been taken away. This was why he couldn't stand people, why he'd sworn them off and put away books forever, never to pick one up again for the rest of his time. "Where is my wife?" the man roared towards the sky. His throat tightened, holding back tears of his own. These horrific emotions, which he hoped he never had to feel again. Pure despair. The man stayed in his sleeping chamber for the next few days, not coming out, barely speaking a word. The shock knocking everything clean out of the man, every emotion, every desire, all will to live. After a week of scarcely a meal, he came out of the room to mutter a thank you, head low, clearly recounting the events in his head every waking hour. The 5 orange boys bobbed up and down through his binoculars. Later in the evening, he took the first deep breath of the week, sighing into his hands. He felt it. From the room, something had let go. The warmth of the coffee he prepared for the man a minute ago lingered, a warmth he didn't realize he missed. Something close to happiness. His trajectory ever changed as the man guided him with emotions towards his own true feelings, learning that the sensations he felt from others could be separated from his own.
April! Miss April! It's July. Huh? Johnston scratched his head. It's September, miss. And why did you say it's April? Asked April, her face expressionless. I didn't. It be your name. I know what my name is, Johnston, April snapped, pushing past the broad-shouldered crewmate. He's resting! Do I look like I care what sheep eat for supper? April scowled at him. No, well, I don't think so. He needs to see it. You found it? Johnston's face lit up. Where is it? He noticed her left hand was clasped tightly into a fist. There was something in that hand of hers. We're not to be disturbed until the clouds massage the moon, Johnston. April turned and disappeared into the captain's quarters. Understood, miss, Johnston muttered to himself, though his words were not the truth. In his head, there lay a plethora of unanswered questions. What had happened to the 4 crewmates that had gone ashore with Miss April? Had she really found the infamous lost treasure of Captain Momus? What was it? How was it possible that she could fit such a great treasure in the palm of her hand? And why was she talking so strangely? No, although Johnston had said that he understood, the truth could not have been more different. Captain Kinley's cabin was dark and deathly silent. So silent, April thought, that she could have heard a rat piss on cotton. As she edged closer to his father's bedside, she lit a few candles to create some light. I found it, Captain who is also my father, the man who ate a whole table for supper on the day of his 13th birthday, and the man who didn't ever not push grains of rice into my mother's eyes. I found it. The pirate captain remained sound asleep beneath his sheets. April looked down on him, tracing his face with her eyes. He does not look like a pirate ought to look, she thought. Despite sailing the seas for almost 4 decades, partaking in much tomfoolery, whoring, and piracy, the man showed no signs of it on his body. He still had both his eyes, legs, and arms. He didn't even have any obvious scars. For a moment, April considered that perhaps her father had never been a pirate at all. She quickly came to the conclusion that her thought had been ridiculous. Her father loved salty water too much to lie about such a thing. April, Captain Kinley softly mumbled as he reached up and felt for her face. Is that you, my girl? No, it's January. What was that? The elderly Captain Kinley was barely cognitively functional at the best of times. There was no hope for him now. I found it, Papa. The Nile need no longer weep with daggers. There was a single tear in her eye. I always wanted to see Egypt, the old pirate coughed, trying to sit up. There is little worse than when the blue men sailed to England for the cheese. Here, take it. April opened up her hand, revealing a small golden bean. Her father's eyes almost burst out of his head at the sight of it. He found himself unable to divert his gaze for even a second. He could not even blink. It's for me. The old man's face flooded with tears. He had never cried like that before. And April had never seen anyone cry like that before. But if earlier that day she had been in possession of a looking glass, then perhaps she might have. Careful, It's heavier than the leftovers of a badger who ate eggs on toast. I always loved eggs on toast, the captain wept, taking the bean into his own hand. He curled his fingers and held the treasure tightly against his chest. His tears vanished. Keeping it safer than wood would be smart, Papa. The pirate did not speak. He was conscious, but he was no longer present. His hand slowly began to drop from his chest, and as it reached his lap, his hand ever so slightly opened. From the small gap emerged a thin piece of cloth. April leaned in and opened his hand all the way. In her father's hand was a golden eye patch. Haunting screams reached the furthest crevices of the ship. April had made clear to Johnston that she and her father were not to be disturbed, but there was no way to keep the whole crew from rushing to investigate. Johnston, standing with more men than could reasonably fit inside the captain's quarters, could barely lift his jaw from the floor. A disturbed snake dances in milk, April laughed hysterically, her hands soaked in blood. Despite the shared feelings of shock felt by the crew, a couple of men managed to work up the courage to step in and apprehend her. She did not put up a fight. Johnston moved in close to his captain's bedside, inspecting Miss April's work up close. Captain Kinley had always been good to his crew. Johnston had known the man a long time. He did not deserve such a fate. Johnston reached down and removed the golden eye patch from his captain's lifeless face, revealing a desecrated eye socket. He looked around for the socket's former inhabitant, but there was no sign of it. Green tasting of the smiley seagulls, April screamed out, still laughing as she was hauled out of the room. Johnston looked down at the golden eye patch in his hand, but it was gone. Instead, he found himself holding a fat golden bee. He was allergic to bees.
The key to piratehood is setting your insides on fire with rum, to feel your chest grow warm with the burn of each swig. That was what their navigator would preach after each meal. Grab us another, Fenrir. The boisterous navigator pointed him towards the cupboard behind the depleted wine barrels. He sat neatly on a crate with a map on his knee, glasses sliding down his nose. It was their 7th day at sea, having wasted their time drinking away their rations ever since their last stop on land. A barrel of corked wine. Fenrir fought with the cabinet door, stuck in the frame and nearly falling off its hinges. The last bottle of rum. Tark, you better slow down. This is the last one, he said in a defeated tone. There was no convincing Tark. The most common of common sense could not make him budge. A few meows resounded by the pantry. He looked over at the 3 stray cats. The little pests snuck on board a couple of moons ago. He threw them the chicken bones left on his plate and watched them fight over it. The scent of sweat filled the damp room as Tark and Mollo threw down the last bottle of rum. Mollo, the crew's self-proclaimed smart guy, was no good at holding his liquor. Triggs, the ship's captain, peeked through the door, hair unkempt as ever, a wild look in his eye, the other eye being covered by an eye patch, with part of a scar peeking out from underneath. Any more rum? The captain yawned. Mollo looked around frantically, regret in his voice as he fumbled for an excuse. Not that the captain would be angry. He was a gentle, soft-spoken man, contrary to his reputation of savagery. Their captain had an obsession with history, most exclusively the history of pirates, some old book perpetually in his hand, the hand with most fingers still attached to it. He'd rant about ships laying at the bottom of the ocean, snuggling up against the sand dunes and seaweed, the writings of deceased pirates ever in his searchlight. Fenrir found the captain peculiar. He was far too impulsive. As a ship's doctor, he couldn't condone the captain unceasingly rushing the crew into fruitless battles. Medicine came naturally to him, having grown up with his mother's homemade teas and balms. He spent evenings with the ship's chef, Poi, sitting on the floor of the small kitchen, making herbal potions, taking turns using the stove and sharing stories with the smiley chef. Vials and dried weeds filled his coat pockets, along with a golden blade at his hip. It was laced with poison, wrapped carefully in cloth, and tucked inside its holster. 2 of the crew members sat idly in a corner, a pouch of dried fruit shared between them. They had joined their crew on their last stop. They were the only women on board, though disguised as men, with loose trousers, white shirts, and large hats to cover their faces. The captain, Dejected and rumless, went over to the two to steal a handful of their treats, easily striking up a conversation with the two. The captain found immense value in their company, as they were seasoned readers and writers. Their conversations turning to background noise immediately, not an ounce of sense in their cryptic exchange. The women called themselves Ruggs and Radsey, Radsey's voice rough and deep, and her shoulders wide. It was enough to fool a drunkard into thinking it was indeed a man, while Ruggs could only pass as a 9-year-old boy. Fenrir's friend Sarad slammed open the old oak door and made his way down the stairs. "We've reached land," Sarad huffed heavily as he crouched under the low ceiling and rushed back up the stairs without waiting for a response. They would joke he was as tall as their shipmast, musculous arms which carried him high up the ship's rigging as their trusty lookout. He had great wonder in his eyes, a big smile ever across his lips. Fenrir was already on his feet, rushing to the deck after the other man. He looked towards the starry night and immediately noticed the speck of land in the distance, heart beating with vigor, more than ready to discover what was ahead of them. The complaints about having a rum-free excursion quieting down as the remaining crew emerged and lined up against the edge of the ship. "I don't like the look of this island," Fenrir said, frowning at the smoke emerging from the north. "Actually, I believe it's an archipelago, not an island," Mollo said with a tone so arrogant it was nauseating. His bony arms crossed over his visible ribs, brow raised. He ignored the statement along with the rest of them, and took the binoculars from Sarad. The treasures they had found thus far were only coincidental, simply a side quest for their mad captain, his obsession with books and adventure often causing them more loss than profit. Their ship had several engravings from the previous crew, one of the most notorious pirate crews of their century, the Sapphire Pirates, ruling the seas just half a century ago. Their captain was, to say the least, a big fan. There was a large symbol carved on the mast. He'd see the captain standing there often, observing with a thumb on his chin. He'd learned the tale of the captain of the Sapphire Pirates, who had hidden their dearest treasure in a field of flowers. As the myth said, if you bring his bones to the Doria's flowers and pour water over them, the treasure will reveal itself. The Doria's plants were growth so large they resembled trees with yellow petals, only growing on the Isle of Flora, the island they were anchoring by at that very moment. The rotten carcass of Captain Odag in a conspicuous crate, wood marked with a red skull. Ragged shoes on sandy shores, they stumbled drunk towards rich flourishing woods. Apart from Fenrir and Triggs, who were as sober as a pirate was allowed to be, so just a little tipsy. Their previous adventures amounting in treasure perhaps a quarter of the time. Their captain spent day and night accumulating and reading old maps and journals left by pirates of the past. Not for their treasures, but for their story. The lust of gold being left for Tark and Mollo, while the captain collected the sacks of journals and papers from whatever treasure trove they searched. Mollo would sniff out the treasures and riches. He was the only reason the crew could eat. They did not know what in fact the captain was searching so frantically for, but they came along on all of his journeys either way. They set up camp in the woods as the crew passed out on the humid grass. Fenrir went deeper into the woods to stock up on medicinal herbs. The island was overgrown with vegetation, abundant with fruit-bearing trees. Poi, the chef, got busy picking fruits and chopping wood for their ship's stove. Grunts and rustling woke them the next morning, a group of dark-eyed sailors hovering over them, oozing with murderous intent. "What are you doing in these parts, pirates?" the largest man of the group barked. Fenrir blinked, promptly looking over to their captain, who was still asleep with an open book on his nose. "We are simply exploring the land, fine sir," Mollo said after jolting awake, hands up in fear, talking them down with nonsensical articulation. After minutes, it seemed their skepticism lessened. "The Dorias are in full bloom. You better set sail before the night falls," the large man said. The captain sat up in a rush, leaving the comfort of the grass. "The Dorias," the book slid from his lap as he scrambled for his pocket watch. "Who are you?" he then said to the handful of new faces standing in the midst of their camp. "Never mind that. We have no time. Grab the bones, Fenrir, Sarad." He threw on his tattered jacket and ran towards the path to their left, hat askew on his ruffled hair. If you're going for the Dorias, it's that way, another sailor spoke up, pointing the captain towards the south of the island. Oh, right. The captain shifted his stride, searching his pockets for a compass. The bewildered crew stumbled after him. Fenrir let out a huff and hiked the red-marked box up onto his shoulder, Sarad taking the other end. The sailors seemed lost, but still wandered after the pirates. After hiking uphill for half a day, everyone but Sarad was tired and sweating profusely. The sailors were whispering horrors about the flowers. How, at night, the flowers would attract myriads of titan moths. Enough of them to cloud the entire scope of your vision and cover your entire body. They'd crawl into your nose and mouth until you suffocate. It made Fenrir shiver, swearing to get away from the flowers before night was due. The field of flowers at last came into view, stems growing nearly as tall as the trees, with large flowers sprouting along the stem's surface. The captain ripped off the wooden boards of the crate, to then lay the bones in the middle of the field, emptying a barrel of water over it. The rotting carcass sunk into the earth, slowly, and then the ground opened up from underneath, revealing a glimmer of gold, the crew's eyes going wide, sure that it must be the shine of a real treasure. The setting sun reflecting its light across the entire field. The captain crouched before the revealed treasure, eyes filled with unshed tears. This is Odag's treasure. He shook as he picked up a tiny copper box. Much to the crew's dismay, the captain revealed a letter. A collective sigh escaped. Even the sailors looked disappointed. He read out the contents of the letter. It was a love letter to Odag's wife. Their captain shed tears as he read it, his hands shaking with anticipation. They had a child. They had a child. His legacy lives on. Having spent years to find a single letter, the crew was baffled. That's it? Sarad said, shoulders hanging. Nonsense. This is everything. The captain seemed to be the only one thinking that way. We have to find him, the captain shot up with wild eyes, striding back to where they came from, rustling the large stalks on his way. Find who? Fenrir shouted. The captain looked confused, searching each of his crew members' faces. Well, obviously, find Captain Odag's son. His superior was strict, a strange and tall man with a stoic face, eyes holding him prisoner. Every pinch of salt he drizzled, every ounce of cream and liquor. The tall ceilings of the restaurant hung over him like a fog. The dim lighting and dark blue interior, the parlor where the bar was. His nausea wasn't as bad when others were around. They muted the bad taste in his mouth. The air felt the worst when he was left alone with the head chef. The fog would make him dizzy. The head chef would get these eyes, darkened and swirling with intent. Each meal he prepared after hours, the tall man would devour. Each drop of gravy, every crumb and every bone. He could never forget the sound of him chewing the bones, the crunching, the awful strain in his jaw, and how his face twisted in delight. After a year under his care, the head chef mysteriously died. The fog didn't ease up. He'd taken over the job as the head chef, and with the job came increasingly intense feelings. His stomach dropped every time the newest hire was in his presence, predatory instincts taking over like a drug, inhaling with the wish to grasp her scent. The large pan he was working with on the stove contained a broth he'd let putter for hours. He kept tasting it, but it was missing something that he just couldn't put his finger on. He frantically threw in spices, herbs and pinches of pepper. Nothing seemed to change the taste. It was so full of flavor, but he might as well be tasting the dust on the floor.
Yum.
As soon as she walked in the door, he inhaled deeply, her scent mixing with the soup. How heavenly it was. He'd tremble, hands wanting to grab her and shake her over the broth. Now every time he cooked, he wanted her to come taste it, so he could get her to come closer to the heat of the stove. Every meal she prepared, he'd taste and then devour. He could taste her, pieces of dead skin, hair, her scent. He'd panic at night, Unable to sleep, wrangling his covers into twists. He knew he'd tipped the point of insanity when he devoured the pet fish in his aquarium. Not even cooking the fish like he'd been dreaming of doing every night. But Rebecca, she was different. Now he'd throw up each time he ate a normal meal, unless it was cooked by her. He'd lick the spoons she'd used. He'd crawl on the floor searching for strands of her hairs. He remembered how the previous head chef had licked the plates, crunched on bones with those hollow eyes. Now he knew. It was a curse he'd inherited. He heard Rebecca say something, but it didn't register. He let his tight limbs loosen and his clenched jaw fall. He pushed her so she stumbled forward. The soup she was making spilled, burning her hand. He barely heard her scream over his beating heart. The scent of burnt raw flesh all-consuming. The live jazz music playing from the dining room muted her cries. It was as if he blinked and the world had changed and unfolded before him. He opened his eyes to a half-eaten carcass on the cold tiles beneath him. The wall painted in streaks of soup and blood. He sat back against the wall, colors blending together on his white shirt. He smiled, lighting up one of his cigarettes. His voice sounded deeper, older. Don't you think the world is such a strange place, Rebecca?
In a perfectly normal house, beside a tall wooden tower, in a street full of magic, with mystery and power, lived a girl unlike any other, only 6 inches tall, so tiny and neat, in a pink little suit, with no shoes on her feet, always carrying a little black handbag with her everywhere she went. Her name was Hilda, and she was a giraffe. Unlike others of her kind, Hilda walked on her hind legs, could talk, and even enjoyed doing the odd crossword puzzle. Each day after her breakfast it was nothing if not peculiar. 3 oats, a gummy bear, and a shot of semi-skimmed cow's milk. Hilda would climb up onto the roof of her human-sized house and get into her Hilda-sized rocket. With a whoosh, she would launch high into the sky before leaping from the aircraft and parachuting down into the tower next door. In the tower, there lived an exuberant man named Hector, whose camel-like features and tendency to spit as he spoke reminded Hilda very much of her Uncle Cammy. Hilda had long been dependent on Hector's generosity, but lately had been feeling a need to be more financially independent. But unfortunately for Hilda, being a giraffe meant that she could not legally have her own bank account. She pondered for weeks before eventually broaching the topic with Hector, who of course was eager to help out. He told her it would not be a problem, and that he would pull some strings for her, just so long as she gave him 30% of all her earnings. Hilda concluded that this was such a great deal for her, as 30% of nothing was still nothing. She had nothing to put in her bank account, but she thought that just having one was sure to bring her comfort. Despite her fondness for the charitable Hector, Hilda was never quite comfortable when visiting his home, for in his tall tower there dwelled another, Hector's sister Wilma, whose face resembled that of a sickly mouse following facial reconstructive surgery, was a grieving widow. Hilda did not necessarily have any grievances with widows, but Wilma, as a widow, had become a frightening, malicious presence. Whenever she caught Hilda alone, Wilma would seize her by the nape and force-feed her thick clumps of blue hair. Where Wilma got the hair, or why it was blue, was a mystery to Hilda, and frankly, she was not so eager to find out. In the 3 years since her husband's passing, Wilma had not been able to move on. She spent day and night looking for ways to somehow resurrect or communicate with her lost love. Her latest scheme, bought from a travelling bear named Shambles, was an especially strange one. Shambles had convinced Wilma that in order to resurrect Arlen, she needed to fill Hilda with coloured hair, place her in a deep, tight cave, and wait for her to vomit the hair back up in the shape of a whale. According to Shambles, this whale-shaped creation would somehow bring Arlen back from the dead. Hilda, understandably, was not a fan of this plan. She had grown ill from all the hair Wilma forced upon her, and eating it had become unbearable. Sometimes when Wilma tried to shove another clump of hair down her throat, Hilda would snap back, biting Wilma's fingers. In return, Wilma would spit on Hilda's spots and growl in frustration. Hilda had had enough. She decided that she would stop visiting the tower altogether. Instead, she found herself exploring parts of her own home that she never even knew existed. In the attic, Hilda came across a plate of fruit. Hilda had never seen fruit before. and so she was not at all spooked when she found it levitating and conversing. For weeks, Hilda returned to the attic every afternoon to spend time with her new fruity friends. All the while, she could not help but gaze at one specific piece of fruit, wondering where she had heard his name before. Arlen. Yes, Asher spoke into his phone, devoid of all emotion. He listened while a voice on the other end spoke to him. A single slice of dry bread was staring up at him from the stained oak table in front of him. The bread lay directly on the table, no plate to be seen. Pristine silverware was laid out beside it, and a large glass of tap water lingered nearby. Yes, Asher spoke again, then listened again to the caller. His living room was dull, devoid of personality. Anyone who met Asher would have been shocked to see his home, as its aesthetic was the antithesis of his strange and vibrant personality. Yes, Asher said again, before returning to listening. To think that things had once been so different for him. For everyone. I will, said Asher. When? Asked the caller. Now. Asher put down his phone and then reached for his water glass. Without hesitation, he tilted his head back, his eyes staring up at the ceiling, unhinged his jaw, and then dumped the entire glass out into his mouth, most of it splashing over his face and chest. His good shirt was now soaking wet, but he did not seem to care. Setting down the glass, he got to his feet and walked out of the room. He made his way down the hall and into a closet. A few moments later, a bright flash of light could be seen emanating from underneath the closet door. 3 days earlier, Asher was in a panic. His heart had never pounded so hard, so much so that he was sure that it was preparing to burst out of his chest and devour the sun. Stranger things had happened. He was no longer living in normal times. His panic drove him straight to Mike's place, where he rattled on the door insistently until Mike eventually opened it. It's all gone to shit, Mike, Asher erupted, barging past Mike into the hallway. Mike was a slim, pasty-looking man in his mid-30s. He made a habit of combing his hair over to try and cover his bald spot, but it did him no favours. What has? Mike asked, his voice as dull and drawn out as ever. If Asher didn't know him so well, he might have thought Mike had been one of the empty. The Jims, the Jones, the mice with the trombones, all of it. It's all falling apart. We need to act now, or we're done. There'll be no surviving this. Asher was flushed and breathing heavily. He had sprinted all the way there. Although he was a little younger than Mike, he wasn't at all as fit as he had once been. The two men made their way towards the kitchen, where they sat down opposite one another at the small table, which was covered in playing cards. I've taken some liberties, Asher went on. I think we can get by without the jars from Suzanne, which, in the long run, might actually work out better for us both. I mean, did we really want to be around those things? I'll never understand them. Jars are for jam, not skin. Mike didn't say anything for some time. He just sat quietly pondering what Asher had said. However, it was clear that he was confused about something. Mice can't play trombones, he finally spoke. That doesn't even make any sense. Says who? Asher shot back defensively. I do. When did you become the authority on what mice are permitted to do, Mike? Their mouths are literally too small, Asher. It doesn't matter whether they're allowed to or not. Asher let out an exhausted sigh. These are tiny trombones. No one makes trombones that small, Mike argued back. Why won't you believe me, Mike? Because it's ridiculous. I'm being ridiculous. Asher shot to his feet in frustration. You know what? Maybe I'll just join the rest of those vacant fools out there in the world. How does that sound? Enjoy being alone. You don't mean that. Maybe I don't, but maybe I do. Asher sighed and sat back down. Do you have anything to eat? I'm starving. Without a second thought, Mike reached down into a pocket of his jeans and pulled out 2 half chunks of a chocolate chip cookie. He held it out to Asher, who gave him a disdainful look. Oh, fine, Mike huffed, getting to his feet and searching the cupboard behind him. Here, he said, handing Asher an unopened packet of cookies. The two of them sat quietly for a while as Asher loudly and unceremoniously chomped down on 3 of the cookies at once. So, what's going on with Suzanne? Asked Mike. She's blown, done, kaboom, like a big bloody rocket that explodes anytime a badger says salad cream. Mike's expression tightened and he began fidgeting with his watch. Are we okay? I honestly don't know. You know how she is, always discreet. But these people, discreet, but really weird, Mike cut him off. Do you think she was born here? That's a little racist, Asher, don't you think? Well, yes, I'm convinced she came here from some colony of bug people. You've seen those eyes. They are pretty terrifying, Mike agreed. Asher slouched in his chair, scratching at the stubble on his chin. This whole thing is such a mess. 4 months, Mike stated plainly. 4 months and the whole world has already gone to shit. I knew people were sheep, Asher sighed, but I didn't think they were this bad. And to think they used to laugh at guys like us. Conspiracy theorists. I always hated that term. Asher crunched away at another cookie. So what's the plan now? You want to just hold out here until we know more? Asher did not respond to Mike's question. He was too busy thinking something over in his head. Eventually, he asked a question of his own. Do you ever think the world would be a better place if anteaters needed licenses to live? I can't say I've ever thought about that. How great a life would it be just to work for the agency dealing with that? Asher fantasized with a smirk. Just think about it. Standing on the side of the road, pulling them over, then when they don't have one, snapping their necks and leaving them dead at the side of the road. A hall monitor's wet dream, Mike quipped. What if the hall is already wet from little people walking around pissing on the floor? They don't piss on the floor. You don't make the rules, Mike. Asher was getting annoyed with him. If they do piss everywhere, then being a hall monitor is probably dangerously stinky work. Hall monitors are already stinky, Mike. Inside and out, Mike agreed. They carry around little piss bags, little zippy plastic bags that they pee in so they don't have to use the bathroom and can maximize their time being total fucking dweebs monitoring the hall. What do you think happens if they trip and fall? Wouldn't piss go everywhere? I don't think they care, Mike. Right. After a brief silence, Asher stood up. I'm going to sneak home and grab what I can on those soulless reprobates. I'll text you a meeting point. The street outside Asher's apartment was deathly silent. Only a few months ago, his street had been one of the busiest in the Central Belt, but everything had changed. Asher, cautious as ever, made his way inside the apartment building and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, but when he got there, he found that his door was already wide open. For a moment, he considered turning and running back to Mike's place, but no, he couldn't do that. Asher crept his way inside, trying to make as little noise as possible as he moved. By the time he reached his living room, it was clear that whoever had been there was now long gone. They had been looking for something, a fact that was obvious from the mess. Documents were scattered all over the floor, chairs upturned, and cabinets pulled to pieces. Asher ignored all of that, heading straight to the kitchen. Garbage was all over the floor, and for a moment, he thought his chest was collapsing inwards. Asher breathed a sigh, feeling relief like he had never felt before when he found the hidden flash drive still taped to the underside of his trash lid. He didn't know how they had missed it, but he was not one to question good fortune. Asher quickly pulled out his phone to text Mike. The park, like most other places, was almost silent, despite it being populated with people. Mike and Asher were sitting back to back on 2 benches, pretending not to know one another. Mike was wearing an old brown trilby hat. Asher thought he looked ridiculous. This is it? Mike asked. It's not enough, Asher mumbled. It's something. We won't get anywhere with it. Vague statements aren't enough. They've taken everything else I had. It was Suzanne who had the real stuff. I never liked Suzanne, Mike huffed. She was old and smelly. Dogs are better. I hope they took her jars, Asher grunted. Should we run? Your call, Mike. Well, running isn't really my thing. I prefer more of a brisk walk. It's hard to take in the scenery when you're moving any faster than that. Runners are freaks. What are they even practicing for? How often do they expect to be chased? I'm going to go home and call my mother, said Asher, ignoring Mike's questions about runners. Then I'll just wait. Are you having people over? I'd love to come for supper. It's been all right knowing you, Mike. That night, Asher climbed into his bathtub, still fully clothed. For the first time in years, he wept. He wept like a baby. He had just ended a phone call with his mother. What am I supposed to do? He thought. This isn't normal. I'm weeping. I don't feel anything. Not anymore. What's left that separates me from them? He recalled the devastating conversation he had just had, how his mother had revealed she had decided to follow the crowd and get her own telepad. You're dead, he had told her. Don't you fucking get that? You're all fucking dead. You're not my mother. They've lied to you, to everyone. They never really worked it out. It's a sham. I've seen the proof. There is no tunneling. You're just a copy, a product, a lie. We could have had everything we wanted, he thought to himself. The world could have been so good. There was so much hope. But now there is no world. There is no hope. It's the end. I thought I could do something. I thought I could show what I found and expose. What's the point in anything? Everyone's already gone. And those that aren't, they're invisible. I see them in the streets, going about their days, having coffee. They don't even eat properly. They can't drink. They're all broken. The world is broken. I can never forgive these people for what they have done. And if there is a God, justice, or karma, I believe it will be paid back. 3 days later, Mike was at home playing cards. He got up from his game to answer a knock at his front door. "Oh, hey, Asher," Mike said with surprise. "Hello, Michael," Asher replied, and the two stood in awkward silence for some time. "Are you coming in?" "I'm already in." "To sit down?" "Okay." The two men walked to the kitchen. Mike sat down at the table, but Asher stood rigid beside him, holding a small white envelope in his hand. "So, what's up?" Mike asked, trying to break through the awkwardness. But Asher did not respond. "What's in the envelope?" "It's for you, Michael." Asher handed him the envelope, then edged around behind him, clutching something else behind his back. "Oh shit," Mike exclaimed, pleasantly surprised to find a tiny trombone inside the envelope. Mike collapsed onto the table, lifeless. Blood poured from the back of his head. Asher raised his hammer and clubbed his former friend twice more, for good measure. The shadows cannot hide you. Not from you, I see. Or from that little girl. Slowly now, no sudden movements. So she did see me. I wasn't certain of it. Usually there's more screaming involved. She did not seem too bothered. Bothered enough to have her father seek me out. Had you not wondered why they hadn't returned home? I said slow movements, Blubfang. Don't mistake my patience for incompetence. Move like that again and I'll swipe this blade through your mandible. Do you really have no qualms about killing an endangered species? You're a trespasser that does not belong here. One who entered this home without so much as a knock, who has roamed freely around it as though it were your own, decorating the dark corners with unwanted trails. And you have grown. That means you've been feasting. The last I saw one of your kind, they were barely the size of a kitten. But you're the size of a human child. I admit I have fed. I am not ashamed of it, for if I had not, I would be dead, and my kind closer to extinction because of it. Do you have any idea how desperate I had to be to come to this place? I'm not interested, Blubfang. Herinthius. Huh? My name is Herinthius. You expect me to address a monster by the requested name? You do know what I am, do you not? I do. Is decorum really that far removed from you? Coming from a demonic thing such as, you may not be the only killer here, sir, but only one of us is innocent, and it is certainly not you. What's that? Speechless now, are we? Devouring. Do not start with that. As I already made clear, if I did not hunt, I would be dead. There is venom infused in my soft, malleable fangs, but I was born this way. What's your excuse? If you were to count up all the lives you've taken, how long would you be counting? Humanity needs protectors. Protectors? You fancy yourself some kind of hero, a defender of the innocent. How many creatures have tasted your steel just for the mere crime of daring to live? I kill those who harm human life. And where is your evidence of me doing such a thing? Where are my victims? I presume you have evidence to back up these serious accusations. You are intruding in a home that is not yours, terrorizing a delicate family. You don't truly believe that. I've been living in this house for almost a month without incident. I have not harmed a single human. Then explain your size. You've been eating something, and it certainly isn't oats. Am I really this threatening? Stay back. Last warning, Blubfang. Horinthius. It does not matter. That little girl who you claim not to have harmed, I saw the marks on her arms. And do not play me for a fool, Horinthius. I know what those marks are. Is she in pain? I wouldn't know, and it matters not. I thought human hearts were supposed to be larger than mine, yet you would kill me with malice, not the essence of your blood. There is no poison bubbling within your mouth. You are draining the life out of that girl. I am not. Then explain your size. There are others. Dozens of them. I take small amounts from each of them, so small they'd never notice. It is against my morals to do harm to others. A monster with a conscience. You expect me to believe that? I expect you to believe nothing. You have shown me your colours, just as I have attempted to show you mine. But just try to find a single case in this city where someone has suffered from my actions. You will find not one. I am sorry for scaring the girl, but I do not believe that being seen should cost me my life. Say I were to spare your life. Would you expect me to just let you remain here? What of the family you have now taken advantage of? I will not leave. I cannot. You're not helping yourself, Horinthius. Where would you have me go? The world is hostile to my kind. I cannot survive out in the wild surrounded by beasts. They'd sniff me out and put an end to me. Only here in the city, surrounded by humans, can I truly hide. I have been clear, Blubfang. I do pity you somewhat, but this is no place for you. You cannot remain here. You will have no say in it.
Soft. This is soft. The small creature smiled widely, a few teeth peeking out. The 6 teeth that were left, sharp but clearly rotting. As soft as concrete. Now tell me where you found it. Terry rolled her eyes. She didn't expect another one of these things to come stealing from the locals, simply because there were so few of them left. She'd seen 3 Gungrers in 2 weeks, and another monster that she couldn't catch, a dark being that disappeared in the shadows. I told you, it's mine. The Gungrer hugged the red gem close to his chest, the gem about the size of his head. It has a sticker with a price on it. Did you buy it then? With what money? She stalked after the thing as it waddled towards the door. Money? I have it, he said, as if I don't know your kind uses mealworms as currency. Filthy Gungrers. She grabbed his long back hair and pulled him to the floor. Hey, I have a name, you know. And what's that? Morwort. Come on then, Morwort, hand it over. His callous 3-fingered hands ran over the surface of the gemstone. You can't fool me with those big eyes. It doesn't work when you smell like a rotting carcass. I smell? He sniffed his arm. You smell really bad, yes. She reached out for the gem. I don't think so. And wait, I just need a second with her. She's speaking to me. He rubbed his thumb over the shiny gem, smudging it with his oily hands. Terry released a sigh of dread, sitting down with her back against the door. You know I have bigger monsters to catch, right? I know a big monster. He smells, actually smells, unlike me. I've seen him near the fir woods. Oh? Tell me more. He's a big meanie, and he eats all the mealworms nearby. He doesn't talk like me, but he runs really fast. Do you know what monster this is, Morwort? Have no idea. But you know, if you let me keep this soft red beauty, I might have an idea where you can find him. His brown eyes gleamed red as he stared lovingly at the gem. A smile took over her face. She had an idea for this little Gungrer. Oh really? I suppose I could ask Miss Tella if she would agree to letting you have the gem, but I don't think helping me this one time will be enough. Tella, I have help to give. I can give help. Morwood jumped up and down, his thin, hairy legs wobbling. I'm sure you know a lot about the monsters in the area, don't you? Yes, I know. There's a ground grinder in the area. Do you know of it? Ground. The one who ate the greens growing at the human's farm? That's the one. So you know of the incident? Word spread fast. We have our ways. And for once, he looked like an intelligent little man. Though she knows they are, it's surprising coming from creatures that mostly act and look like hairy children. If you can find that thing for me, I'll give you more than just this gem, Morwort. More? More soft things? His eyes lit up. Of course, anything you want. And that was how Terry the monster hunter found her most unusual little monster partner. She breaks her eyelids open to a tickle up her arm. The eggs have hatched. Larvae crawling on her skin. She's hungry. The glass of water on the floor untouched. Days old. Untouched like the dust-covered books piled up by her mattress. Only regretting the cold caused by the bed frame she never bought when she moved in. The cold was way worse than the insect legs blanketing the floor. The crunch was so divine. Earthy flavors. Soft and squishy inside. She plucks them off her skin before they reach her collarbones. She swallows them whole sometimes, just so she can feel them move inside her stomach. The furthest corner of her room is filled with them. Caterpillars and moths near a bright lamp, where she often sits in their company. The door struggles open, a rolled-up towel covering the gap under the door, pushing out of the way. Her roommate doesn't ask, only looks at her with squinted eyes, oozing of skin-tearing disgust. She swallows the scales left in her mouth. I can't believe you live like this. You haven't been out for a week. She leans against the doorframe. I've been reading. Her excuse being she studies insects for a living, though nothing really excuses the filth she's lying in. The people she can't call are lying in the filth as well. She couldn't call. If she did, they would tell by her voice she needed to be in a psychiatric hospital. She didn't want to see them, but their photos were faced up anyways. The bugs never look at her in that way. Some of them don't have eyes at all, while some have too many eyes. Even so, they don't judge with them. She loves them, so she consumes them. Maybe someday it will turn her into one. Thin patterned wings, fussy body, a will to live, the simplicity of laying eggs and eating leaves. She doesn't want to be a lamb any longer. The radio her roommate has on in the kitchen seems louder. She left the door open to her room. Pride in the common, confidence in doing the things everyone else is doing. She can't see the point in living that way. The sheets curl and the caterpillars fight for their lives to not get buried in them. She reaches for the glass of water, small flies floating at the edges of it. She drinks them down too and hopes she won't be taken away by the droplets. You hear about the rats in the sewers, the dirty street rats with snagged ears and red angry eyes, the rats living underneath your floorboards. You know about them too. You don't know about Dimal's rats, living inside his green sofa cushions, between the fluff and the springs. A family of rats cozied up in the warmth. Dimal knows about them, hears squeaks and feels them shuffling around when he sits down. The rats attracted a neighbor's cat. It would sit at the window, meowing until it was let inside. Just for a bit then, Dimal would sigh. The black cat leaping from the ledge, going right for the sofa while sniffing the air. The cat sometimes got inside on its own. He had the window open all summer, so the cat would waltz in as it pleased. He didn't know its name. It had no collar, but he'd seen it come out of his neighbor's apartment. The rats never came out, being supplied with the crumbs inside the couch. They'd eaten a fair share of the cushions as well. The rats didn't bother him. It was almost comforting having them there. The cat would lie on the couch next to him, waiting for the rats to come out to play, but they never did. The rats seemed in distress. He'd heard them all night, scratching and whimpering. He'd never invaded their home in the cushions, but one night he felt like something was gravely wrong. He picked up the cushion and began digging out the cotton. Picked up his flashlight and pointed it inside the cushion. He saw a cluster of perhaps 20 rats. The others screamed and writhed, seeming to be stuck. His heart sank at the sight. He cut up the cushion with a knife and fully unveiled the rats. He expected them to scatter around like bouncy balls, but they moved slow like a single organism instead of multiple. He realized the horror of it all. Their tails were all tangled up together in a large knot, the dead rats being dragged around by the live ones. He felt ill, nausea spreading through him as his brain throbbed against his skull. All of a sudden, he couldn't believe he'd let this creature stay with him, inside his home, where he would doze off with the rats right under his head. He backed away from the thing.
The cat was meowing and scratching loudly at the window, with hunger in its eyes. He let it inside.
Dinner had always been a nightmare for Terence, but tonight it was a special kind of hell. His family sat downstairs, chattering away like chirping birds that had been dipped in madness-inducing custard. Meanwhile, Terence, well, he was rotting in the upstairs bathroom, trying not to gnaw on his own tail. It had started a week ago, innocently enough, with a rash on his back. Now, though, things had progressed into a full-blown metamorphosis. Terence clutched his stomach, leaning against the bathroom door. It was getting worse. His belly churned, feeling like 1,000 tiny legs were scurrying just beneath his skin. Every twitch sending another wave of nausea up his throat. He glanced down at his hand. It was barely a hand anymore. Long, bony fingers ending in black claws covered in patchy fur, and his nails, yellow and curling, like dead things. They smelled like mold. He could feel them again, inside. The rats. Every time he swallowed, it felt like they were clawing up his throat, each bite of his insides pushing them closer to freedom. How had it started? He could hardly remember. A bite? A nibble in the night? Some strange encounter in the basement he hadn't told anyone about? "Terence, honey, are you coming down?" his wife Helen called from the hallway. "The soup's getting cold." "I'll be right there," he squeaked, wincing as his voice warbled unnaturally, like someone was wringing out his vocal cords. He could feel his teeth growing longer in his mouth, sharp and stained yellow. He gritted them together, not wanting to open his mouth too wide for fear he might screech like some alley rat trapped in a tin can. "They're gonna notice," he muttered to himself, hands trembling as he stared into the mirror at what was left of him. Tufts of greasy fur sprouted from his arms in patches, like moss that had decided to grow only where it wasn't wanted. His face, a hodgepodge of whiskers, bulbous eyes, and twitching lips, looked like someone had slapped a man and a sewer rat into a blender and hit puree. But absurdly, his face wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the tail. The thick, pink, twitching horror of a tail that had sprouted just below his spine and now slapped the bathroom floor in frustration, knocking over his wife's shampoo bottle with a wet thud. The rest of him might have passed for some disfigured, unfortunate creature, but the tail? That was unmistakable. The rats were getting louder inside him. He could feel them gnawing, biting at his ribs. Terence grabbed the sink with clawed hands, trying to focus, his mind starting to slip as the rats burrowed deeper into his body, making themselves at home. He could almost hear them now. He froze. They were laughing. No, whispering. High-pitched, tinny voices from within his own chest. "Terry, you're ours now. Why fight it?" It wasn't just whispers. It was conversations. The rats were debating things inside him. "Tiny bagpipes aren't real," one of them said smugly, scratching its way up his esophagus. "You just don't understand the size-to-sound ratio," another argued back. Terence glanced at the bathroom door. What would happen if he did go out there? Sat down at the table, maybe tore into some bread with his new crooked teeth. His father-in-law would probably raise an eyebrow, make some dry remark about his new look, and his wife would politely pretend nothing was wrong, like she did when he often tracked mud through the house. He could hear his mother-in-law cackling over something, probably another one of her ridiculous stories about how she once wrestled a goose in a parking lot for a half-price sandwich. God, how he wished that goose had won. "Terence!" Helen's voice sounded again, but closer now. Was she right outside? "You better not be eating without us." His stomach gurgled violently. He doubled over, retching into the sink. He coughed up something wet and gelatinous, a lump of fur-coated phlegm, slapping into the sink with a grotesque plop. Then it started again, and this time came something small and hairy. It wriggled in the porcelain, tiny claws scraping against the ceramic. He stared at it in disbelief. The rat looked back at him, sitting in the sink, its tiny whiskers twitching. "Hey," it said, in a voice that sounded remarkably like his mother-in-law. "Don't forget dessert." Terence recoiled, slamming his fist down on the rat, crushing it into a mess of fur and blood. but as soon as he lifted his hand, another one crawled up his throat, and then another. His mouth was overflowing with them, the squeaking, scurrying things spilling out, pouring onto the floor in a wave of writhing fur and teeth. "Terence, we're waiting!" Helen's voice was now cheerful, almost sing-song, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Terence backed into the corner, watching as the rats multiplied, filling the bathroom, clawing over each other to escape the sink, the toilet, the cracks in the floorboards. His skin was beginning to tear. He could feel them underneath, wriggling their way out. They were going to burst through him any second now. His body was just a cage, a sack of flesh keeping them trapped inside. His mind, unable to cope, raced with absurdities, memories of the way his father-in-law picked his teeth at the dinner table, or how his brother-in-law once insisted that horseradish had healing properties because it smelled like hospitals. His chest split open with a wet, sickening sound, and out they came, dozens of rats, gnashing their teeth, tearing through his shirt, his skin, his bones. They scurried over him, leaving behind nothing but a mangled, empty husk. And yet, he was still conscious, still aware. He was in the rats now. All of them, part of them, 1,000 little voices in his mind, chewing, gnawing, laughing. "Terence?" Helen opened the bathroom door, her eyes wide and her face pale as she saw the rats swarming the room, filling every surface. "Oh," she said, her voice as casual as ever. "You've started without me." And then she smiled, a wide, toothy grin. 2 long whiskers twitched on her face as she calmly closed the door behind her, leaving Terence with his new rodent family.
The court jester could make his lanky limbs bend in strange ways. He was taller than most, and slimmer than most, parading around town, walking on both hands and feet, his back bending in unusual shapes. The next evening, everything seemed to go wrong. The insects in his brain deciding which words should come out were all absent. He swore he saw a little devil dancing on the edge of the table by the king's arm. The jester turned pale as he watched his expression fall, skin gleaming with red as his fork sunk into a turkey leg, perfectly on cue with a gust of wind from the open window. It snuffed out the dripping candles that lit up the room. "Did I allow you to speak?" the robust king shouted, rattling the contents of the table. The king silenced the poor jester's mumbling with a firm hand on his throat. He made a single joke about the king's appetite, not tastefully so. At that moment, he thought he'd be done for, skewered like the lamb on the king's plate, decapitated like the chicken, roasted like the potatoes, his flesh pulled clean off his bones like the tender ribs. He thanked the little devil for at least letting him keep his clothes on for the day of his passing. The grip tightened around his throat, the intent to kill growing apparent. The door abruptly swung open and the obnoxious advisor came strutting in, not even flinching at the sight before him. "Sir, we have news from the Queen," he said, holding a handwritten note up to read. The king discarded him to the floor, like the handkerchief he'd wiped his mouth with at dinner. The Queen had shut herself away at the right wing of the castle for the better of a week, not speaking to the king for what was probably a very good reason. The timing was impeccable, though he was sure he'd lost his job. It was for the best, having no idea how the king found him entertaining at all. His Majesty heard the Queen's demands and was off in a rush to fulfill them. And there the court jester was left heaving for his breath with the advisor peering down at him. "If you haven't left within the hour, I'll have to schedule your execution. It's best you go quickly." He pushed up his round glasses, and the lanky jester took the advice. He very hastily packed the few things he owned and was on the road before he could run into anyone else at the castle, hoping the affairs with the Queen would make the king forget he even existed. He really wasn't cut out for jestering. All he had was his strange body, and nobody but the king found him amusing. Others found his unnatural talents unsettling and kind of scary. He would join a circus, but no circus had ever wanted to hire him. Strangely enough, as if destiny itself carved the very path he walked on, his wandering gaze caught a large pine tree shadowing 3 men setting up camp beneath it. Strange men that reminded him of himself. Not a circus per se, but it seemed like the grounds for one. The first guy had a basket of lemons. For some reason, he seemed to have a permanent smile on his face. The second guy was extremely hairy. He almost mistook him for a bear. And the third, which seemed the most interesting to him, was a ghostly-looking man with a goose on his shoulder and a rolled-up newspaper in his hand. He was so drawn in by the odd trio, he didn't realize he'd walked off the road. He stood before the smiley lemon guy, who still wore a toothy smile. They took no offense by his direct approach, nor the questions he posed. They were lonesome people, traveling to find a home fit for the strange. And it was all laid out for him on a silver platter, the perfect path for him to take, assuming the smiley lemon guy wouldn't kill him in his sleep.
In the backstage bathroom, Marl stared blankly at himself in the mirror, the weight of his upcoming set looming over him like a pancake balanced precariously on a lobster's head. He sighed as he adjusted his oversized floral patterned tie, the kind you'd find in a discount bin at a thrift store. His reflection looked back at him with all the enthusiasm of a depressed moth lamp. He glanced at his watch, 5 minutes till he was up. The dim hum of the audience, already irritated and hungry for anything remotely resembling humour, buzzed through the thin walls of the club. Marl muttered his opening joke to himself. "Why did the cow walk up the hill? Because it had no legs." There was silence. He stood alone, not even accompanied by his own spirit. The joke hung in the air like an unwanted raccoon eating rice cakes. He tried again. This time, he was serious. "What's burgundy, sits in trees, and doesn't eat salmon?" Marl paused for a moment. "I don't know either." His reflection winced at him. Marl knew he was bad at this, but tonight, it would be different. It had to be. He could feel it in his bones, or at least in the itchy spot between his shoulder blades where the rash had started. Was it nerves? Maybe. Or maybe it was the lice skating on corn seeds. The stage manager poked his head in, searching for him. "Marl, you're up in 1. You good?" "As good as a pineapple in an ice rink," Marl mumbled, grabbing his prop scuba gear, his ace in the hole. With a deep breath, Marl shuffled himself to the stage. As he was introduced, the dim light of the club met his face, washing him in a lake of lukewarm indifference. The audience stared, already confused by his tie and the way he stood slightly hunched over. He grabbed the microphone, feeling its cold, greasy texture. He definitely did not want to lick it. "So," he began, his voice as shaky as it was determined, "have you ever wondered why equations don't grow on trees?" There was a pause. The whole room was pregnant with confusion. The audience blinked at him, eyes wide open, like owls being lectured on nihilism. Marl continued, smiling awkwardly. "No? Me neither, but I did see a blue fish yesterday, and it was selling ice cream for dead dinosaurs." A lone cough echoed out from the back of the room. "All dinosaurs are dead!" another voice called out. Desperate times called for desperate measures, Marl thought to himself, pulling his scuba mask and snorkel over his face. All right. Here's one for the thinkers in the audience. Why don't hamsters snorkel in urinals? Because they'd need way more practice. Dead silence. Someone audibly sighed, and Marl quickly took the mask back off. "Did you hear about the pigeon who became a lawyer?" An audience member stood up and walked out before Marl could deliver the punchline. His heartbeat quickened, and his hands started to shake. He could feel his body betraying him. His rash was now tingling. No, it was burning. Was he breaking out in hives? Marl was allergic to bees. He tugged at his shirt collar, desperate to escape the feeling of suffocation. Was it hot on stage, or was it just his career burning up in flames? Speaking of pigeons, he wheezed. What's the deal with glue? It's like, hey, let's stick things together. He burst out in maniacal laughter.
But what if it's the glue that gets stuck? Huh? The audience stared back at him, their expressions turning hostile as if they were waiting for a punchline that had been lost somewhere in the nothingness of space. Without warning, Marl's rash burst. Something hot and wet trickled down his back, and a thin strand of steam rose up from his shirt collar. His shirt, once a nauseating sea of pink polka dots, was now melting. It dissolved into a puddle that disturbingly looked like strawberry jam. Marl panicked, grabbing the microphone stand for support. He could feel something moving beneath his skin. Something big. I've got one more joke for you, Marl gasped, his entire body trembling involuntarily. Why did the... But before he could finish, his chest erupted with a soggy stomach-churning pop. Out of his torso emerged a creature. Long, scraggy legs and large, bulging eyes stared out into the club audience. It was as if a monstrous bug had been gestating inside him all along, waiting for the right moment to burst free. The audience, frozen in horrific disbelief, watched as the creature clambered out of Marl's collapsing body and casually scampered across the stage. Marl, or what was left of him, slumped to the floor in a heap of dissolving jam and soggy scuba bits. Pausing for a moment at the edge of the stage, the creature then turned back to the microphone. It tilted its oversized, unsightly head, tentacles convulsing as it leaned into the microphone and clicked its mandibles. So, what's the deal with Santa Claus?
Pink eye. What? I said pink eye. The hollow witch cackled, a long finger pointing to his face, her skin nearly melting off her bones like butter. The little round window across the room revealed his reddened eyes to him, and promptly his eyes began throbbing in his skull. His skin matched the color of his eyes, a boiling, crackling wrath, causing his cloak to shake, dusting the floors with a quick burst of his levitation magic. It wasn't me, Dorbus. Calm yourself. I told you entering the house would have consequences. Then how come you're not affected? I have my ways, she scoffed, looking at the rotten ceiling. The gifted witch had myriads of spells sewn within her mind, spells no other witch nor wizard could cast. Perticella the Hollow, they called his wise, wicked sister. She was a mere 5 years older than him, but seemed to have a wisdom so incomparable her reputation exceeded his. With all that power, she nevertheless chose to look just as old as she was. Foolish to him, who as a several centuries old wizard gulped down vile potions every morning to remain as a 23-year-old, which most magic users did to stay young, or to alter their appearance. She was unique in that way, enjoying her career as a mummified sack of wrinkles. Well, take what you need and leave before you turn into a pig. Or perhaps you'll just turn pink. I don't know what's worse. She hunched over, giggling. Curse you, sister, he said, grinding his teeth while scraping the wall with a conjured knife. The walls were littered with mushrooms, the awful hallucinogenic kind at that. She sat on a rotten footstool, watching with a growing smile, at least as much as you can smile with no lips and teeth. Hey, what's in that pocket? She was behind him before he could blink. He dropped his knife to the floor to cast a spell that stopped her claws from grasping for the contents of his cloak. A golden quail egg, his newest power relic. The egg was hovering in the air between them. Perticella's hollow eyes darkened, her smile reaching her ears. Just let me look at it, Dorbus. Just a look. She stared up, deceitful whispers at the corners of her mouth. She was half his size, her body nearly folding in on itself with that back. It was so crooked he could possibly use her as a cloak hanger. The ground shivered, a deep rattling in the ground beneath them threw his balance off. And for the split second it took for him to cast his hovering cloud spell, the witch snatched the egg from the air. Controlling cursed magic, that was completely unique to her. Dirt particle magic. She sunk with the floor as the soil cocooned around her. Thank you for the wonderful gift, brother. I'll see you in the next century. and with that, she buried underground with the help of her magical roots. The spells he cast had no effect. He yelled incantations as his blood boiled within his veins. She was gone. He failed to notice that he had in fact turned pink.
It just wouldn't work. Despite the 4 months spent trying to perfect it, Vodia just couldn't crack it. But her spirit would not be dampened. She couldn't lose to that awful old wizard. She just couldn't. She tossed the latest dead mouse aside, landing it in the bucket beside her alchemy table. There has to be a way, she thought to herself. She got up and began pacing back and forth. It had been over a week since she had last left the tower. Her obsession and many sleepless nights were painted across her face plainly. She hadn't spoken to a single person in that time. Visitors had been ignored, and that was a big deal. Vodia had a reputation for helping locals with their problems. That was how she made a living. But more importantly than that, it was how she maintained a decent reputation. It was not common for a witch to be accepted by regular folk. But Vodia couldn't help herself. She had heard rumours of Sidarius's progress. Rumours that implied he had almost completed his work. If he finished before her, she'd surely be done. There was no room in the town for 2 magicians, and the people would obviously back the more competent of the 2. Bang, bang, bang. The door at the bottom of the tower rattled. Vodia's heart sank in an instant. None of the locals ever knocked so aggressively. She considered ignoring the noise. But bang, bang, bang. She rushed down the cold, winding stone steps, not even bothering to put on her boots or check to make sure her golden hair was somewhat presentable. At the bottom of the steps, she took a deep breath, then opened the door. It was just as she had feared. Sidarius. You're out of luck, Vodi. The old wizard pushed past her uninvited, beginning his ascent up the tower. Vodia quickly followed after him, stunned by his audacity. Who did he think he was to just storm into her home like that? His pompous attitude had always bothered her. And you say I'm the cruel one, Sidarius noted, gesturing towards the bucket of dead mice. You had no casualties? Vodia asked through a tensed face. Unimportant. The wizard had made himself at home and was now browsing through her collection of books. Will you be taking all these with you when you go? When I go? You've lost, Vodi. Surely you don't intend on stomping around and protesting like a petulant child? I've not lost, Vodia argued. Not until you prove that you can do it. Very well, Vodi. He leaned on his staff and scratched at the bald spot on the back of his head. Give me one of your mice. I have no more mice, she said, looking over at the bucket filled with dead ones. In that case, we must improvise. How? Put this on. He handed her a glowing blue ring. Don't look at me like that, Vodi. This isn't a marriage proposal. You're not at all my type. If you think I'm going to be your test subject, you have lost your mind, Sidarius. Perhaps you don't have a choice, Vodi. Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you. So long as you behave. How can I trust you? Vodia asked, squeezing the ring tight in her closed fist. How can I know that this ring will only shrink me? Very well, the wizard sighed, stretching out his open hand towards her. Give it here and I'll show you. Vodia opened her hand and took the ring in her fingers. Instead of placing it in Sidarius's hand, she swiftly slid the ring down his finger. His scream of pain quietened almost instantaneously as his body shrunk down to the size of an average field mouse. He was desperately trying to pull at the ring to remove it, but it was futile. Vodia had imbued it with the essence of fire, and so it had fused to his finger as soon as it settled on it. There would be no sliding it back off. You witch! Sidarius's squeaky screams called out from the dusty floor below. She couldn't see his face clearly from how far above him she was, but she suspected he might even be crying. Don't act like you wouldn't have done the same to me, Sidarius. She took a step towards him, and he tried to scurry away, only to trip and fall on his backside. He looked up at her from beside her foot, which he was only half the size of. He was already covered in dust, which made Vodia realize that she ought to get some dusting done in the near future. Vodi, please, the old wizard begged, and in response she gave him a soft kick with her foot, which sent him rolling across the floor, cutting up his face and arms as he scraped against the wood. How many times have I told you not to call me that? I hate it. My name is Vodia. I'm sorry, Vodia, the wizard coughed. It's too late for that now. I realize that you came here on false pretenses, Sidarius. You see, I know that our task was impossible. If you had truly managed to do it, you would not have come barging into my home trying to aggravate and intimidate me. You'd have gone straight to the townsfolk to gloat, as you have always done. The truth is, you came here to snoop on my progress and gain a new lead. Or failing that, you'd planned to do something nefarious. Get away from me! Siderius yelled. Why are you picking me up? Where are you taking me? I lied. Huh? About the mice. I have plenty more. Through a door at the far side of the room, Vodius took Sidarius over to a covered steel bucket filled with a dozen live mice. She tuned out the wizard's desperate screams as she removed the lid. Moments later, all of her problems were gone.